Hello and welcome back to another episode of Multi-Tech Spec. And today I want to show you something very, very interesting. One of my websites has been fiddled with, shall we say. Not necessarily hacked, but fiddled with. And today I'm going to explain my ways of figuring this out, that it wasn't my website, but actually a CDN problem. So here we go. Here's what I did. I was walking through the woods one day, going to my website today, hosted on WordPress, and it says verify.robo.xyz, right? So this was perplexing to me, right? Because I thought to myself, hang on a second, I saw some illegitimate activity coming into my Cloudflare account. Now, obviously, me being me, I thought, okay, dictionary hack, somebody's got in, no big deal. Change the password, everything looked good for the next day. So I thought to myself, oh, okay, the perpetrator doesn't have access to the password, therefore it's going to be fine. Okay, admittedly, there's no 2FA. And I do that on purpose because, well, a lot of the times when I'm using different tools which use API access into Cloudflare, like Terraform, for example, then it causes a few issues because 2FA is active, right? So without 2FA, without having the session token, getting in and out of the account is a bit difficult, right? Now I say that, but at the same time, Cloudflare does have API keys which you can use for certain sessions, which are restricted, so that way it's okay. So I'm going to explore that a little bit more detail a bit later on. But the point is, I've got this. When you're looking at these, you think to yourself, oh, my site has been hacked, right? Because WordPress has certain vulnerabilities. Now, when I created the websites, I architected them in such a way that the platform is generally secure. And I say generally secure because there's no such thing as 100% security. If we're going to say there's 100% security, well, we're laughing. We're just talking rubbish. There's no such thing, right? And that's evident if you've seen the news, for example. We've seen, uh, you know, big name brands get hacked nowadays, right? Big name brands in the shopping industry, right? Retail, I should say, which have just been hacked recently. And we've seen certain glitches, for example, within their infrastructure, which has signified a potential hack. In my case, going to this botnet, right? Verify.rabonet.xyz, right? So Cloudflare, if you're watching this, please be aware that this is happening on people's systems, and please be aware that it is a thing. And I'll show you that in just a second. But first of all, I'm going here, I'm looking at it, I'm like, oh, okay, maybe, somebody has put some malicious code inside of my backend or something like that, probably got into my system through, exposed plugin and done some naughty things, right? So therefore, I'm seeing this, is what I'm thinking. Now, on my other systems, I was thinking to myself, well, okay, the platform's 5 years out of date. It runs on an operating system which is no longer available, right? That was Core OS. You can't get it anymore. Now they call it something else because IBM bought the company that makes the operating system. And I thought to myself, okay, well, it's 5 years out of date. It's a fairly secure system, but we're getting the same thing. I thought to myself, okay, well, rebuild the system. I already have some playbooks which can secure it. So using Ansible, can't use Terraform because it's hosted on VPS. It's not hosted on cloud. So I said, okay, fine. Well, I can go and use Docker, use all those DevSecOps tools that the security industry and the DevOps people proudly love, right? So it's like, okay, cool, great, all well and good. But here's the thing that I noticed. If I go back to Cloudflare, right? You see how it says the proxy status is proxied, right? But we got the RoboNet uh, XYZ coming up. I was like, okay, proxied. So therefore, it's going through the cache, potential error, right? Is what you think. But because I got no telemetry, I've got nothing to say that, oh yeah, there is actually a hack because, in normal architecture, you'd have logging, you'd have CloudWatch, you'd have OpenTelemetry, you'd have Prometheus, you'd have uh, Grafana to give you that insight, and even, Elk Stack, for example, right? Because we're a small company, we don't have those particular facilities, right, in place because they cost us quite a lot of money, right? And people don't understand this. It takes a lot of money and resources to store a lot of data, right? It's not free to store data, as many people assume it is. You actually have to put it somewhere, right? It would be on a hard drive, the cloud, wherever. EFS volumes, EBS, whatever it is, right? It costs money to do that. Ingress and outgress costs are a thing, right? So in an architectural space, it costs a lot of money. So what's your best bet? Well, store them locally, right? Store the logs locally. That'll be your best bet. Get them from the Nginx ingress control. Get them from either the Nginx ingress control if you're running Kubernetes. Get them from Nginx proxy if you're running it on Docker. Store the logs in a volume on the drive, right? Somewhere, preferably which is secure. Okay. So annoyingly, I'm not able to do that. The only thing I can do is say docker compose logs minus f to get the docker compose logs because it's stored in Docker, right? So makes sense. Now, I'm not seeing anything. I used AI to create a debug script. Nothing comes up. Just says potentially malicious code, but it's all sort of plugin related. It's nothing to do with actually what's in the code for the plugin itself because there's no malicious code being executed. It was just like, oh, okay, something's happening. Here's the trick. Okay. So how many minutes in are we now? We're 6 minutes in. I still haven't explained this. So if I click on edit and untick the proxy status, the interesting thing about it is, okay, its proxy status is off. Okay. Now in my browser cache, if I go back to the same site, right, this is what it's supposed to look like. Okay. Okay, this is what it's supposed to look like. Now, if I go back to that, it will say, oh, it goes back to Rabonet. So you're thinking to yourself, okay, it goes back to Rabonet. I've taken out the cache, which is in front of it, the CDN. It still goes back to Rabonet. Okay. So what can you do at this point? Well, the next point is to say, well, what happens when we remove any sort of browser caching, right? Now, here's the trick. The browser cache itself, right? If you inspect the elements, right? If you go inspect, you'll see within your sources tab. No, sorry, not your sources tab. It's called network. There we go, network tab. See how it says rabonet.net, right? It's here, and it says all this other stuff, right? Chromium, all the headers, right? Strict origin when cross origin, right? From the header information, all that kind of stuff. Okay, but there's nothing to explain what's causing that, right? So let's try it again. So it looks like we're getting 200 hits from some server somewhere, okay? But this is not our server, okay? So how do we know that? Well, we can testify the IP addresses. We know the IP addresses of Cloudflare, right? Which is normally 104 range. We know the IP address of the actual origin server, right? So we know those two bits of information. Therefore, we know, okay, well, something's up, right? There's a redirection which is happening. We just don't know at which level. We don't know if it's at the server level within the plugins. We don't know if it's at the CDN level, okay? So we can spot pretty quickly what's going on because of that behavior. The question is, well, okay, where is it coming from? Okay, so what do we do? Well, we don't have any logging per se to say where exactly it is, which is kind of annoying. There's no sort of like antivirus in Linux-based operating systems because, well, it doesn't really need it. You can have things like ClamAV, right, which does that particular thing, and it's used a lot in various organizations. But really, realistically, for your home hobbyist, for your semi-professional, even professional people don't really claim, we use an antivirus because, it's not really a thing in Linux. So, telemetry is kind of lost. Don't know where things are. Okay, that's fine. That's still not a problem. We can still work with that, right? So here's what we do. We know that this is going somewhere. We don't know exactly where. We know it's going to an IP address. We can ping the IP address. We can ping where we think it's going, right? By examining the headers actually. Or we should be able to examine the headers in this point. So we already had one, which was Rabonet. But because I have my antivirus on my computer, this is why we get this particular screen, right? Because it's being redirected again, right? Interesting that, right? So we had one redirection. Now we have a second redirection, which is part of the antivirus. So we don't exactly know what's going on here still. We're still kind of thinking, okay, seems a bit dodgy. Okay, so what should we do now? Well, let's get rid of browser caching because this is all coming from the browser cache. Okay, let's assume that it is at least. So next thing, in private, and we're going to go to the same address, right? We're going to go back to the same place, which is called the Mental Health Project. Highly recommend that you sign up for the newsletter. It's got some cool stuff about mental health, which I'm going to be looking at I'm working on in the future. But let's go back to our incognito mode. Okay. Now we have no browser caching because that's what incognito does. It doesn't have any sort of browsing history. So let's go back and let's see if that works. Okay, well, it says the connection is not secure, but we still have our address. Okay, so what's going on if we click continue to site? Do we get redirected? No, we just get an expired certificate. So what's going on with the security then? Interesting question, right? Because it uses Let's Encrypt, so it should be automatically renewing. So either the certificate expired today, right? Yesterday when I did this recording, it didn't, or something else is happening, right? But here's the interesting thing. That SSL certificate issue is a separate issue. It's not the issue which we're actually looking for, which is the redirect issue. Okay, so before we get startled, we should understand that the SSL certificate issue, which is part of this problem, is a separate issue. It's not the main issue at hand. It's a red herring. Okay, so here's the kick. So here's the thing. Well, we're saying, right, okay, well, everything looks like it should be working, looks nice. Let's just check other parts out of different paths to see if they work. Okay, well, the cart works. You know, the checkout works. We're familiar with the application because we built it, so we know what the actual inner working should be in terms of what the actual outcome should be, right? So the cart is working. You know, my account looks like it's working. Sign up is working. Sample is working. You know, all the pages are there. So, you know, there's nothing wrong with the website itself. It's just making us think that there's something wrong. Okay. Okay. So where do we go from here? Well, there's two things that we can do at this point. The first one is we can check from inside of our configuration whether or not there's a change that's happened to Nginx in terms of redirection. So the Nginx reconfiguration may be a point of entry, may have been breached from the platform level, right? Or via the application level, but the application is working, so we can rule that out, right? Or it's from the CDN level. Now, here's the choice that an engineer would have to face. Do you go to on the platform level, or do you go to the CDN level? Now, from this particular experiment, we can kind of rule out the platform a little bit here because the platform is behaving the way it should be because we're getting information, okay? Because we're getting the information that we want out of the system. So it's working, right? It's reasonable to assume, okay? We shouldn't assume. I'm not saying you should assume, but it's reasonable to assume, okay? So what does that leave us with? Well, it leaves us with CDN level. So if we're not familiar with Cloudflare necessarily, then where do we go for CDN level? Well, we need to look for documentation that tells us about redirection. So let's look at some documentation about redirection. Okay, so how does a Cloudflare redirect form? Because we know that that's the kicker, right? That's the thing that's causing the direction in the first place, right? Because we checked proxy on and off, and we know that that is the provider which is hosting the DNS entry records. In other words, the glue record is actually on Cloudflare. It doesn't necessarily need to be, but it can. But it is on my case, right? So we can ask the DevOps guys, okay, well, you know, how is this thing working as an application in terms of the platform to give us some indication as to what's going on, and also talk to the developers, right? And this is the idea behind cross-functional teams. Okay, so in the industry at the moment, there seems to be an idea of having something called cross-functionality between teams in order to establish a rapport with different people within different teams. Okay, and that's something which is ongoing, right? And I think this is kind of in response to things like DORA frameworks, which let's be honest, don't work, right? And people may be thinking, well, hang on a minute, these do work because we use them in industry. Yes, they work in the industry. They don't work for the industry. There's a difference. And if you don't believe me, look at the guys in health. They'll explain it to you in a lot better detail than I can. So having that knowledge, right, here's what we can do. Let's look at the Cloudflare documentation for redirection. Okay, it takes a bit of time, but we can see that there's something called URL forwarding within the Cloudflare rules, right? So if we look at these rules, what does the documentation say? It says rules, page rules, okay? And within the Cloudflare account, we can see that there's something called a 301 permanent redirect or 302, which is a temporary redirect. Ah, that looks familiar, doesn't it? Because when we were looking at the page, we were being redirected. We were going from a 301 to a 302, right? We were getting something along those lines, right? Because when the cache was off, we went straight to the site, despite the SSL certificate problem being HTTP, right? HTTPS. We know that that's going to happen at some point because, we have Let's Encrypt as a technology to renew the certificates every X amount of days. So we know it's going to happen at some point, right? And it's at the end of the month now. So, reasonable to assume it's expired. Reasonable. Perfectly, fits within the logic. Okay, cool. Now, let's see if there is actually a 301 on our account, right? Now, I have to tell you, and you must understand that when this is happening, right? I didn't put this on. So if you see something funny, you'll see what I mean in a minute. But here's something interesting as well. So here's forwarding examples. You see how we have these different paths, which like products, which we have in our particular website, right? So we have /cart, we have /sample page, that sort of thing, right? This is called a regex pattern, and the regex patterns, as you can, does it have an example here? Oh, okay, it kind of does. So at the front, you see that star? It's called a glob within regex. So what happens there is that anything which precedes www gets matched for that path, okay? And that can be written as something like /star, which means anything preceding the path will get matched and therefore gets redirected. Anything before the path can be redirected depending on the syntax that you use in terms of regex, okay? There's just a couple of examples here on the page, but you get the idea, okay? There's advanced stuff, like we were talking about here, see, preceding the same pattern, $1 for traffic, so it goes to somewhere else, and all that good stuff. Okay, now we're getting somewhere. Okay, cool. Now that that's done, let's go back to our website, and let's go to rules, and let's check if there's any page rules. Okay, we can see that there's nothing in terms of the page rule overview, which is fine. So what if we looked for page rules itself? Well, that looks interesting. I'm pretty sure we didn't put any sort of page rule stuff in there, right? So for example, we've got the 301 redirect, which looks pretty interesting. And we also have it going to the site which looks dodgy. So what does that suggest? It suggests that the Cloudflare account itself has been hacked through a password or dictionary brute force attack, right? Using something like rainbow tables. So what's the moral of the story here? The moral of the story is security from different levels of the platform is important, right? That includes the platform, that includes the application, and includes the CDN delivery network. Okay? That's the moral of the story here. That even though we think we're doing due diligence at a platform level, there are different levels within the system which can cause us confusion because we think that they're interconnected, when really they're abstracted. And that's the kind of problem within the industry right now, is that we have so much abstraction, it's difficult to actually understand and pinpoint where certain things are failing because of its abstractedness. And it's one of the things whereby a monolithic approach actually might be more beneficial because everything's tightly integrated. The source code is actually written within the application and the infrastructure itself to suggest what's going on where, because it's one big application as opposed to being distributed, where we think, oh, well, because it's distributed, we can see it a lot more quickly. Well, it depends on the layer in which intrusion can happen, because now you have, instead of one thing to protect, you have 12 to 15 different things to protect, like microservices architecture. Okay, so if anybody asks me that as an interview question, there's my answer. So I hope that helped you to understand a little bit about kind of the attack vectors, kind of what's going on in terms of what's going through the system, where a particular attack vector can happen, which is at any level, be it application or otherwise, and kind of some of the steps that you can take in order to remediate some of these problems. So here's what I'm going to do. Now that redirect, which we have here, is not going to where I need it to go. It's actually going somewhere else. Okay. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take out these page rules because they're just rubbish. Okay. I've already changed the password to this account and made it more secure, so I don't need to do that anymore. Right. But that should be fine. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to monitor that over a couple of days to see whether or not the attacker has something called a session cookie installed. Right. if the attacker has a session cookie installed, it doesn't matter if I've changed my password. They already have access to the session, so they bypass the need for a they bypass the need to have a new how do you say, new password, right? They bypass the need for the password as long as that session token is still valid. If it isn't valid, then they need a new password because that session has refreshed. Okay, so here's what we're going to do. We've taken out all of that stuff. Okay, I am going to see now whether or not that works, right? So got rid of it. Good, happy. Okay, that means it's not going to redirect anymore through the proxy. So let's go back to the overview. Go back to the domain, which is called thementalhealthproject.com in DNS, and we can see that DNS is off. Very good. Let's check within the browser cache to see if it's been updated. Okay, and it's still going through. So it may take a bit of time, but that should go away once the cache has been updated, once we purge everything from the cache. And on top of that, once the time to live has been decremented to a good point. Okay, so we'll ignore that because we know it's not true. There's nothing there to redirect back to this botnet. It's just cached within the browser. Okay. And it's not on the proxy as well. So that's another point. Okay, so here's what we're going to do. We're going to put this back onto proxy, and we're going to purge the caching information. So let's go to configuration, purge everything from the cache. Okay, takes 5 seconds. We'll give it a little bit of time just to see what's going on. Okay, let's go back and double check that we actually have the proxy on within our DNS rules. And as you can see, it's there, it's proxied. So now, with all due respect, we should be able to go through. It says the connection was reset, but it's still going back to the botnet because there's browser caching. We have to remember there's a browser cache, which needs to be purged because that rule no longer exists. But if you go back to it in private and you go back, it should go straight through, despite the SSL error. Okay, it's still going back to the botnet, which is interesting. But there's 2 there, which doesn't make any sense. It shouldn't be going back there now. Okay, well, let's try on a different device. Okay, so on my phone, that's working okay. It's still a little bit of formatting errors, but that's fine. But yeah, that seems to be working fine. Okay, so that's interesting. So what we can do is we can say, well, okay, it's probably just this browser causing that issue. We don't know, so let's try a different browser. Yeah, that works fine. And there we go, right? That's working fine. Of course, you know, the SSL certificate is probably expired, and it's probably going to renew very shortly, you know, because it's all automated. So I'm not too worried about the SSL certificate problem at the moment. It is a vector of security problems, but at this moment in time, I'm not too worried because I know it's going to automatically renew. If it doesn't, then I have to do some investigation. Okay, so I think that's fine for now. Let's just check that everything else works. Yep, that's working fine. That's working fine. That's working fine. Yeah, everything seems to be fine. No particular issues. Good. You know. And let's see if that also works in incognito. Yep, that's going to a different place. But oh no, it's working fine. It's working fine. It's just got some weird stuff going on that. But yeah, that looks to be working fine. And sometimes, I'm not sure why, but this also displays funny on different systems. I'm not sure what's going on with that. But it's incognito, so I'll accept it as a bit of a source of truth, but not as the source of truth. Okay. But yeah, essentially it's working. There's no real issues, just a bit of teething issues. But yeah, I mean, you know, it's working fine. So there we go. So if you ever have a WordPress problem whereby you're getting some sort of redirect coming in, or you need a bit of an idea of how to do some analysis, this is the video for you. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed it, and hope to see you again soon, and I hope it solves your issue. Appreciate it.